In this video, I'm going to show you how to create a functional component with some state. So in the source folder, let's add a new folder called hooks. Here we add a new component called counter.jsx. Now, to create a functional component, we can type rsf and press tab and then escape. So nothing magical here. We have the import statement on the top and a function that returns a div. Now, over here, let's add a label counter. Now, this is where we want to display the value of our counter. So we need state, and this is where we use React hooks. So a hook is a function that allows us to hook into React features like working with state or lifecycle methods. So on the top, we're going to import a hook from the React library. It's called useState. So all these functions that start with use are examples of hooks in React. Okay. So here we're going to call useState. We give our counter an initial value like 0. Now this is going to return an array with 2 elements. So let's store it over here. Now the first element in this array is the value of our counter. That is equivalent to this.state.count in a class component. So we can store it in a constant called count and then display it over here. Pretty straightforward, right? Now, in class components, we also have a method called this.setState that we inherit from the base component class in React. But here we don't have inheritance. That's why we don't have the setState method inside the function component. So how are we going to update the value of our counter? Well, I told you that the useState function returns an array with 2 items. The first item is the value of our counter. The second item is a function for updating this value. So that is equivalent to this.setState. Let's store it in a constant called setState. So this is a function, okay? Now, we can rewrite these 2 lines using array destructuring. So instead of declaring 2 separate constants, we can extract these items, the first and second items, straight away on line 4. So we use the array destructuring syntax. We type square brackets, and then we type count and set state. So with this syntax, the first item of the array that is returned from this function will be assigned to count, and the second item will be assigned to set state. Okay. Now we don't need these 2 lines. Our code is cleaner. So let's add a button for increasing the count value. So button called increase. Here we need to handle the onClick event. Now here we pass a lambda expression. And in the body of this lambda, we're going to call this function to update the value of our counter. So set state. Now what is the new value? That is the existing value plus 1. Okay. So this is how we can use hooks in a functional component. Very simple. Now we have a compilation error because we are returning 2 elements. So let's wrap these inside a fragment. We're almost done. Now we should add this component to our app component. So let's go to app.js and render a counter component. So here's our counter, increase, there you go. Now we have a stateful functional component. We can also declare multiple state variables. For example, let's add an input here, input of type text. Here we need to handle the onChange event. We pass a lambda expression that gets the event. Now we should use e.target.value to update a state variable. So first we need to call useState one more time. We give our state variable an initial value, in this case, an empty string. Now we get the result and destructure it. Let's call this variable name and the function to update it, set name. So look at the naming convention, okay? Now, over here, whenever the value of this input field changes, we should call the setName function and pass e.target.value. So we call set name and pass this value. Now let's change our label to include the name of the person and say this person has clicked count times. Save the changes. Now, here in the browser, I type my name, Mosh. Our label gets immediately updated. Mosh has clicked 4 times. So this is how we can declare multiple state variables. The values that we're passing here are just the initial values for those variables. In this case, I'm passing an integer. Here I'm passing an empty string. We can also pass an object. There are no limitations. There is just one rule you have to follow. You cannot call hooks inside loops, conditions, or nested functions. For example, we cannot call this hook inside an if statement or a loop. If we do this, we're going to get an error. Let me show you. So I'm going to type if count equals 0. Then we're going to call this hook. Save the changes. Look at this error. React hook useState is called conditionally. React hooks must be called in the exact same order in every component render. What is this and why does it matter? Well, we're calling this hook multiple times in this function. Every time we're supplying a different value. So here we're passing an integer, and this integer is assigned to this variable. The second time we're passing a string, and this string is assigned to this variable. Now, React is going to store this state somewhere internally that we don't see. That is how these values are not wiped out between component renders, because every time this component gets re-rendered, this function gets called again, so these variables have to be re-initialized. So React is going to store these values somewhere internally. We don't see it and we don't care about it. Now, how does React know that this value belongs to this variable? In other words, if React has some kind of storage, how does it know what value belongs to what variable? Well, React relies on the order in which hooks are called. So the first time we call this hook, React creates a state variable and stores it somewhere. Let's say in an array. The second time we call useState, React is going to create a second state variable. This is the reason why we cannot use hooks inside if statements or loops, because these will mess up with the order of calls to hook functions. In other words, with this structure in the first render, both these hooks are going to get called because count is 0. Now, if we click on this button, the value of the count is going to be increased. So in the second render, this hook is not going to get called. And this will mess up with how React manages the state of this function. So we cannot call hooks inside loops, conditions, or nested functions. As I was reviewing this video, I realized I made a tiny mistake. So when using the state hook, I ended up calling this function setState. This is a very generic name that you should avoid. The name of your setter function should match the name of your state variable. So the name of our state variable is count, and it's better to call this function setCount because this function is purely responsible for setting this particular state variable.